This first session is probably the theory-heavy session. So sorry, I need to establish some basic principles. If you don't understand something, assume half the audience doesn't understand it as well and ask the question, right? So please interrupt or challenge. Just to give you the background on this, and this is going way back, all right? My first degree is physics and philosophy, which was an indulgence when I did it. But my father was a veterinary surgeon, and going out to help him with bulls in January in Wales in the freezing cold meant I wanted to do theoretical physics and philosophy, not follow his own career, right? It was an indulgence when I did it, but it's proved quite useful since, because those are in many ways the foundation disciplines, right? Either way, I then worked on the program to combat racism, so that got me around the world in the 20s, and then moved back into HR, Actually, that was my first real encounter in the Middle East. We did all of the survey stuff for Dubai, and I was hiring Muslim pilots to fly over Mecca to do the surveys back in Saudi. So that was my first major encounter, and I learned a lot through that. So I went through HR, went into finance, and then into consultancy, building decision support systems for people like Guinness, and that's quite significant, because those are the early days of computing, and it was very similar to the current hype around AI. The basic concept is I bring in a computer and magically I don't have to manage anymore. And I'm now 70, so seeing these cycles go around on a regular basis is quite scary. So I then got into building those decision support systems, then became effectively business manager, general manager, strategy director for the company. And then IBM bought us and everything changed. We went from a small Anglo-Dutch company with 3 levels of management to being part of the world's largest bureaucracy. If you think the US government is bureaucratic, you haven't worked for IBM, all right? It's a different level. And I survived 7 years there, right? And halfway through that, I got a phone call from the CIA, which was a bit scary. You do not expect to get phone calls from the CIA. But I said it was better to have a phone call than for somebody to knock my door down that when I was in Boston. And went down to Arlington, and they were interested in the work we were doing on narrative and complexity theory. This is about 25 years ago. And met a really nice old guy. I didn't know who he was until I decided I liked him. And that was Admiral John Poindexter. If you remember your history, was Reagan's national security advisor. So that's Iran-Contra affair and all that sort of controversy, right? The trouble is, once you decided you like somebody, it's too late to realize you're not meant to. And there's sort of a lesson from that. And we really worked then on counterterrorism before and after 9/11. So the day before 9/11, I was in the Pentagon, and the bit which got hit by the plane the next day. And we just completed a project on how do you get people from radically different political backgrounds to have a rational, objective discussion about a current situation. Okay? And we are going to talk about some of that material later on, and it was very successful. So I flew out that night, picked up the news the next day, and then life changed. The focus then moved, though we continued with that sort of peace and reconciliation, conflict management stuff, then moved on to how do I detect weak signals? So how do I spot early the signs in the street stories, the day-to-day narratives of people's existence, that a civilian population is going to go from tacit to explicit support of terrorism. And with the benefit of hindsight, you can always see that, but hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. Right, so that was the big project we then started on, and that was when we said, look, you can't trust focus groups. Focus groups are manipulated by the facilitator. The facilitator can't avoid bias in the group. You can't trust how people respond to questionnaires because they know what answer you're expecting. So we have to take a different approach. So what we have to do is to understand the stories of mothers waiting to pick up children from school. The stories over coffee. It's the day-to-day narratives which fundamentally influence people's attitudes. And that was when we developed some of the tools and techniques I'm going to talk about. That got picked up. I carried on with that work after I left IBM, and the stories behind that. And then the Singapore government picked it up, and I co-designed their risk assessment and horizon scanning system. So the 2 principal designers of that were Peter Schwartz, who you may know was one of the founders of scenario planning, So that was dealing with structured, ordered scenarios, and I was leading the complex, how do we deal with ambiguity? So that was the co-design. And we're now a Singapore-based company because of that, because their civil service sponsored this. And it was a good lesson. I'm going to tell you stories as we go through this. So the IBM, I got on really well with the IBM country general manager. We shared the same religion, which always helps, right? Bonding on that. The Catholics tend to band together in that sense, all right? And she said, I don't understand you, but I don't understand you the way I don't understand Peter Ho. And Peter Ho was then Permanent Secretary of Ministry of Defence, which is Singapore's biggest ministry. So either way, she said, I'll arrange an introduction. So she arranged an introduction. We had 10 minutes. The 10 minutes became 2 hours. And the next day, I was an advisor to the Ministry of Defence. And I still remember Peter saying, these are really brilliant ideas, but it's not going to work for 2 or 3 years. I'll fund you while you work out how to make it work. Now, I can't think of any other civil service in the world where somebody senior would say that. And I think that sort of attitude is part of the success of Singapore, and we need to pick up on it. So either way, that was kind of like the background. Yeah? What we then found is that the work we'd done on weak signal detection was relevant to the development sector. Right? So a large part of our work then was working, for example, on complex sexual issues in Africa, on how do you measure development impact in terms of funding. And there's a whole book on that published by Oxfam and CRC, which goes through their cases. Yeah? I remember saying at that point, there is no difference between a terrorist, a citizen, and an employee. Yeah, they all represent what's called the problem of asymmetry, is you've got lots and lots of individuals making individual decisions, and you're trying to respond as an organization to that, and that's a common problem. So we found the work we did on counterterrorism moved across very quickly. And I'll talk now about one of the projects we're currently designing to give an illustration of where we're going to go. Right? So part of the basic underlying principle is that things are more joined up than people realize. So the silos of government, all right, and government initiatives, like we'll have an initiative to solve problem X. The reality is problem X is linked with problems Y, A, B, C, and D in ways that we don't fully understand. And this very linear concept, identify a problem, find a solution, fund it, implement it, really doesn't work anymore, if it ever did, to be honest. No? So we're working at the moment on one of the big healthcare systems in California. Now, people didn't understand complexity really. A lot of us got it 25 years ago, 30 years ago. It wasn't until COVID that it became everybody understood it. Because after COVID, kind of like nobody could say we could predict everything anymore. Yeah, that made it impossible. And and after that we had Trump, and that's made it even more certain that people do not understand what the hell's going to happen next. All right, so that's the background. And one of the things that they've done is to withdraw medical aid from California. The attack on California is a political move. So we've got now the medical companies are having to provide healthcare with something like 20-30% less funding. Yeah. Not only that, the healthcare company we're working with in the insurance industry is really weird in the States, but they get the lowest grade of sign-up. They get the poor people. So they've got an even bigger problem. Yeah. And the trouble is that the hospital system in the States has been set up with and same in the UK, is what's your problem, what's the diagnostic, what's the solution, and process you through in that way. And that actually depersonalizes people. Some of our pioneering work in Ireland is to give people the power to interpret their own experience on a continuous basis. And we'll talk about that later. So the ability to record how you feel, the balance of pain or empathy, and to do that in a quantitative way that the medical profession has to take account is something we focused on. By the way, if anybody's interested, we know how to measure placebo effect. And that's really significant in terms of drug trials and elsewhere. Yeah? So I'm giving you a hint about this. But we also know that if we can entangle health with social provision, with day-to-day lives, we can make a big difference. Yeah? And I still remember one of the projects we did in Ohio, we were asked to look at childhood obesity, which is a major problem in the States. It always scares me when I go to the US and you walk around and you just realize the levels of obesity which exist, right? And we knew that you couldn't approach childhood obesity directly. Children do not handle direct inquiries very well. And there was a double irony in this. The whole project was funded by Victoria's Secret, so there were ironies on this anyway, because everything in Ohio medical is funded by Wexler. So what we did is we made the school children journalists to inquire into adult obesity. So we gave them SenseMaker, we got them to gather stories from adults, we got them to draw conclusions, and they worked out for themselves that they had a problem, and they started to change their behavior. But then they also started to beat their parents up, so their parents changed their behavior, and we got a double hit. Now that involves a very important principle, which I'll come back to, is you solve human problems obliquely, not directly. There's a wonderful book by a British economist called Kay on this, with the title Obliquity. And he points just how often we don't solve problems by dealing with them directly, we move around them and see what solutions are possible. Right, so that's a key principle of complexity. So what we're starting to do is to say, well, rather than treat disease or social provision or whatever as a problem, and by the way, we know that accident and emergency departments in British hospitals are better at doing triage for social problems than social services, because they can get the balance right between medical and whatever. So for example, one of our projects, we ended up putting a social worker into a hospital in Abergavenny in Wales, because that saved a huge amount of money rather than having two separate services. So that single point of entry for triage starts to become a really important question. Yeah? And it's where people feel comfortable to go, not where you think they should go, which was important. And they felt comfortable with A&E. They didn't feel comfortable with lying outside the Social Security office, because that was stigmatized as well. Yeah? So either way, we started to do the joined up thinking. So the principle is, and this is the project we're designing, and I'll go through this again tomorrow once I've built the theory, is we're going to use school children as ethnographers into their environment. That's something we've done in Wales, we've done in Sweden, we've done in Colombia. We're about to do on a major scale in Hong Kong, is to use young people as ethnographers to understand social conditions. Because if young people go into their communities, nobody ever refuses a child on a school project. They get data that researchers never get. And also, it's authentic to that community. It's not somebody from outside coming in, it's somebody from inside looking out. Right? So using school children as ethnographers. We're also going to be working with the church youth groups. You know, the US is very religious in that sort of sense. I put religious in inverted commas. So we're using church youth groups to go and gather stories about what faith means in a modern society. Yeah, just as the school children are learning research and ethnography, so this is valuable for them in their own context. But that will give us data about how people feel at a street level. And then we're going to the medical providers and other people, and we're going to build a huge, continuously evolving, changing narrative database from which we can see different patterns, and we can see how we can link and connect things in different ways. Because something which works in one context will not work in another. And that's a principle I'm going to talk a lot about, is moving to context-specific solutions, not context-independent solutions. Yeah, I say I grew up in Wales, all right, where I grew up in North Wales. It can take you 6 hours to get to a hospital because it's a rural population. Yeah, if it's a crisis, we have to use helicopters. In London, it maybe takes you 4 minutes. Yeah, the London context is radically different from a rural context. These contexts require different solutions. Yeah, one of the things we're now looking at is triage. So if I can reduce the number of people coming into a hospital by maybe 5%, that has a major difference on cost. If I can discharge 1 or 2 days early, that's even bigger. So what we can now do is we can measure effectively the social health of a community into which we're going to discharge somebody and see whether that social environment can support early discharge. Yeah, and again, this is the context. So what we're working on is how do I effectively entangle everybody's day-to-day stories, but into a quantitative, not a qualitative environment. And I can't overemphasize that. Yeah, if it's quant, it scales. If it's qual, it doesn't. So into a quantitative environment Whereas patterns emerge, we can put more energy into the patterns which are successful and less energy into the patterns which aren't. One of the things I'll talk about tomorrow is the work we're doing with the development banks and elsewhere, by which we basically stop people applying for money or for permission, because that will always filter out novelty. How do we, in an auditable way, allow people who can get together with other people from different backgrounds to actually spend a small amount of money very quickly, and then we can see what works and allow the real investment to follow what works in context rather than what people will say will work in context. You're starting to get a flavor of what we're doing here? Yeah. The first new word I'll introduce, this comes from physics, is called substrate, which is a better word than environment. Substrate carries a question of what you're able to do, not just what the environment is. What we're trying to do is to understand and map the substrate of health. Because if we understand the environment we're in, we know what we can do. And one of the techniques we'll teach later on, which has just come out, is the ability to map what you can change, not what you would like to change. Right? So one of the big things we'll talk about, and we'll give you an exercise on this and a chance to work on it, is if you can map what you can change and what you can't change, you actually radically reduce risk and radically reduce cost. What people have been doing for the last 30 to 40 years in Anglo-Saxon environments is start off by defining some idealistic future state. Yeah, so they start off with the utopian definition, then assume they can close the gap, and it always ends up with lots of small dystopias, because the reality is you have to understand where you are, not where you would like to be. Yeah, so that's kind of like the basics. So introduction. What I now want to do is to dive into some of the theory, because I need to shake some things up and give you some basic facts. So just to start off with this slide, the approach here is called sense-making. And sorry about this, I'm an academic, so it's got a hyphen. If it's got a hyphen, it's a verb. If it hasn't got a hyphen, it's a noun. All right? And that's an important distinction. It's a flexible concept. So I define sense-making as how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. And with that comes a concept of sufficiency. I never know everything I would like to know to make a decision, but what sort of decisions can I make based on what I do know? And how can I make those decisions so that my options stay open as long as possible? Because if I close off my options too soon, I've got a major problem. And that's actually what traditional strategy does. You're forced into choices before action. For anybody in a military environment, I've just come back from the Ukraine, we're now starting to say, how do we combine strategy and tactics in the same physical environment? So rather than strategy to tactics, we say strategy and tactics are constantly interacting. And that's as true for health as it is for military environments. Yeah? That sort of switch from linear approaches to non-linear approaches. So that concept of sufficiency is key. The naturalizing, and this is where I'm going to have to go through some stuff, is a philosophical reference. Yeah? It relates to how do you base things in the natural sciences, not in the social sciences. Right? Now, I'll say what we're doing here. All right? Sorry, I did physics at university, and we always used to say that social scientists never had enough data to form any valid conclusion whatsoever. Yeah, but if you look at the way social science works, it's an expert interviewing people or gathering data longitudinally. The expert interprets the data. Yeah, these are two problems up front. You haven't got enough data in the first place, and somebody from a particular cultural background is interpreting it, and they follow conclusions. So one of the things we started to say is that's why we want to create lots and lots of data. We also said that actually, given the levels of uncertainty, case-based approaches will not work. So if I derive my current practice based on cases studied before COVID, after COVID, everything changes. The other problem is if you look at the management literature, it's all based on studies of US manufacturing companies. Then it seeks to generalize it. Well, manufacturing is a unique culture. The US is a very unique culture. You can't take that and apply it elsewhere. Yeah? I come from a tribal culture. Wales, Scotland, and Ireland score in the same way as Africa, Middle East, and Asia. We're commutarian, We fundamentally see our identity as defined by the communities we grew up in and their history. Anglo-Saxon worlds are individualistic. They assume society's individualistic contract. That creates a different milieu in terms of the dependence and everything else you've got. So what we started to say is, well, kind of like it's inherently uncertain. We also get this terrible confusion of correlation with causation, which, by the way, is a real problem with AI. AI is doing correlation, causation, confusion at scale. So if Saudi Arabia wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins, I mean, somewhat ironically here, because if it hadn't been for the Arab nations, we wouldn't have Aristotle back in West, but we won't go into that, right? That's an old debate. All you need to do is increase consumption of dark chocolate, which will go down very well in this culture, right? Dark chocolate consumption per head of population directly correlates with Nobel Prizes per head of population for the last 50 years on a much bigger data set than you will see in any social science paper. So the solution is not an educational system, it's go and eat chocolate. Yeah? The most accurate correlation between success in American manufacturing companies is actually playing golf, not going to an education. The one which I think is causal, if you don't know it, is increasing peaks in attempts to commit suicide by drowning directly correlate with the release of Nicolas Cage movies, but I can see a reason for that. There is a whole website of false correlations, and it's a real danger because it creates convincing ideas. So the approach we started 3 decades ago is say, let's do something different. Let's go to what we know from natural science, which has been subject to repeated experiments and peer review, and use that as what's called an enabling constraint. Yeah? So we don't actually try and derive theory from practice. We say we've got a body of theory which we know is reliable about the nature of systems, the nature of human decision-making. We know that won't change, so we'll use that as a constraint, and we'll develop methods consistently with that. So our approach is very like, if you know the way research works in physics, you start with the theoretical physics, the mathematics, and one day it just looks beautiful, at which point it's boring, so you hand it over to the experimental physicists, who are the ones whose maths wasn't good enough to be theoretical physicists, and then they make it work in practice, and when then they get bored, they hand it over to the engineers for execution. So we carry out a similar approach. We spend 5, 6, sometimes 10 years mulling around with something, talking with different scientists. We actually have a whole research program on this, by which we bring scientists together from different backgrounds, which we'll pass on to you later. That's a key process. Yeah? How do you bring people from different disciplines together is something we spent a lot of time on. Because just getting them in a room together doesn't cut it, right? You've got to change the practice. We'll talk about the triopticon on that later. So basically, what we're doing is say, let's look at that science, all right? Let's basically say, if we know this about human decision-making, we'll use that as a constraint. So that's the principle. So what I want to go is to go through 3 or 4 basic scientific facts I'm going to rely on and make the point. So the first one, and this is a famous set of experiments. If you take radiologists, I don't know what radiologists have done to the cognitive neuroscience community, but they did something really bad, so everybody runs the experiments on them. You give radiologists a batch of X-rays, you ask them to look for anomalies. On the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. This is called inattentional blindness. Could we put it up a little bit just so I can see people? Yeah. No, I'm not a radiologist, all right? But 100% of non-radiologists will not see it. Yeah? Now that's called inattentional blindness. The only human beings who are not subject to that are people who are fully autistic. And of course, they can't operate in the world. Now, the reason for that, just to give you the facts behind this is Clark and other people's work. You are constantly micro-hallucinating. AI, by the way, doesn't hallucinate, it bullshits. It's a different sort of process. It tries to tell you something you want to believe. Right, so micro-hallucinations, and they come from various sources. For example, your own memories. If you look at Walter's work, there are chemicals in the brain which break up the neuroreceptors. So you can never remember anything precisely the same way twice, which in biology is called a gradient. If you don't get mutation, you don't get evolution. One of the problems with AI is it remembers perfectly. If you remember perfectly, it's static. So your own memories are fluxing. You've got the memories of other people through stories, which are probably more significant than your own stories, are the stories from the people you respect. And then you've got pure imagination. If you don't know it, art and music come before language in human evolution. And we think one of the reasons that they develop to the current heights they have is that they allow us to actually create memories which don't exist. We can handle complete novelty through fiction, through art. So all of those hallucinations are going on in nanoseconds, and then you're receiving multiple sensory data. So visual is one, oral is another, but there's also scent. Pheromones are really important to determine whether you trust somebody or not. We now are starting to think that pheromones were the ways that so-called primitive tribes on the steppes in Europe communicated through shaman, because they will spread very quickly. If a woman sleeps in a bed with a baby, her heart goes into physical resonance with the baby's heart and can restart it. We don't yet fully understand how that happens, but it's linked with dowsing rods. Dowsing rods work. Yeah, we just don't know the mechanism. So there's levels of sensory data that we have which we do not yet fully understand. This is why a lot of us are really worried about AI, because it's limited to text and tokens. Yeah? So basically, all of those sensory data is coming in. It's continuously entangling with those various micro-hallucinations, and the first pattern which fits, we apply. We do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Yeah? Now, if you think about this in evolutionary terms, and you imagine the first humans on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of Africa, and having identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to avoid lions? Yeah, by that time, the only book with any use to you, and this is a common heritage, will be the Book of Jonah, which is the only example I found of an escape manual from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. Right? We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan, privileged on our most recent experience. And nobody in this room will scan more than 5% of available data before they make a decision. If you're Chinese, it doubles. It's context object focus. So if you give Chinese students a picture of a tiger drinking from a stream in the forest, they'll remember the forest and may miss the tiger. Whereas American students will see the tiger and forget the forest. We think it's because Mandarin requires you to understand the context of every symbol, and that produces differences. Okay? Now, I spent a bit of time on this because I'm going to rely on this. The Enlightenment model of rational decision-making, which underpins most management theory, is just wrong. Just giving people better information does not make them make better decisions. Whether they will attend to that information is an open question. Yeah. So we don't make decisions in this rational, structured, logical way, which doesn't mean that training is a bad idea. It doesn't mean that competence is a bad idea. It doesn't mean that better information provision isn't a bad idea, but that is not enough of itself. So once we understand this, things change. Now, let's give an example. What we can now do is we can take an existing problem or problem you've got, we badge that up with a necessary level of ambiguity. Human beings don't like certainty. We want some ambiguity. We can then present that to the entire workforce and get the results back 5 minutes later. I'll talk more about this tomorrow. Because what I want is mass consultation in real time, and we can ask people what's happening here, what do you think will happen next over 3 horizons? And I've got that result. I don't have to commission research. I use my own employees as a sensor network to gain multiple perspectives. And guess what? Some of them will see a gorilla. Yeah? And actually the evidence is if I can see that these people have seen the world differently, I will call them in to ask them why. Whereas if they've been knocking on my door to say I'm ignoring them, I will ignore them. Yeah? So that bringing people to attention is key. Now I say that's one example. I'll give several more. Once you realize that that's the case, you have to build methods and tools consistent with the science, not inconsistent with the science. Okay, so I'll come back. When I say 70% or gorilla, you know what I'm talking about. There is actually a good book on this called The Invisible Gorilla. This was produced by the cognitive neuroscience community after Malcolm Gladwell published a book called Blink, if anybody's read that. If you have, don't tell anybody with a science background if you took it seriously, because you will not be invited out for dinner, right? They produced a book, The Invisible Gorilla, to counter it. Gladwell is a good example of what's gone really wrong with American management literature. He creates a convincing thesis, then he finds evidence to support the thesis. Yeah? Now that's a problem, right? And you can see it in other books as well. People want simple solutions. Yeah? Yeah? What they don't want is to actually have to spend time and think, because the world is actually complex. So these simplistic recipes are dangerous. I'll make a big metaphor now. There's a big difference between somebody who uses recipes and a chef. So a recipe book user, they've got the recipe, they can produce good food, but they have to have all the right ingredients and all the right equipment. Whereas a chef can produce a wonderful meal with whatever you happen to have available to you. And the reason is they understand both the theory and the practice. This goes back to Aristotle, which is a common inheritance as well. Yeah, he talks about Sophia and Phronesis. You need practical wisdom and you need theoretical wisdom. You can't rely on one or the other. Right? So that's where we're coming from. This is called theory-informed practice. Okay, so that's one thing. Next thing to come onto this is, what I want to do is to go through, this is kind of like distributed agency, which is something I've mentioned. The fascinating thing, if you go into nature, is that nature optimizes search without any centralizing intelligence. In fact, the critical thing in nature is that there isn't a centralized directing intelligence. Yeah? And this is a problem, because if you have one person or one group deciding what happens, that biases what you see to what they expect to see. Yeah? So let me give you 3 examples we're going to depend on. One is forests. Now, I realize talking about forests in a desert environment is a bit odd, but you are doing really good things with planting trees. So I'm very impressed with that. So you've got the example. Tree roots are arboreal. They go in straight lines. If you cut it off here, everything downstream dies. Connecting all of those tree roots in a mature forest are rhizomic fungal roots, which are actually, if you cut them, they just reform. They have a symbiotic relationship with the tree roots. So in a mature forest in a drought, the fungal roots will redistribute resources to young trees from old trees, so the forest survives. Yeah, it's a fascinating example of symbiosis in nature. Now, let's take that. So our approach is, that works in nature. What would that mean for humans? The equivalent in a human system, and this will be the first big exercise we do shortly, is informal networks. Informal networks are far more important than formal systems in any organization. Right? When COVID, I interviewed a lot of people after COVID, everybody fell back to their informal networks because the formal systems couldn't cope. And of course, in informal networks, you don't have to manufacture trust because they're built on trust in the first place. Now, the problem with this is you can get differences. So if I take Singapore, the Singapore civil service is tightly connected. Everybody is within 3 phone calls of everybody else. And the reason is they all did national service together. And they have a meritocratic educational system, which is I'm hugely envious of. If you're a bright kid in a small school, they pick you up and take you on. So that means everything is connected. On the other hand, in England, and if you haven't understood the linguistic differences here, if you're Welsh and you say British, it's okay. If you say English, it's generally negative, all right? So you don't know that. In England, everybody in the elite went to the same private schools and the same 2 universities, so the networks are not dense enough. Yeah, they're actually quite perverted in that sense. So one of the techniques we'll talk about later is how do you get everybody in a network to within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else? Because at some stage you've gone to somebody in power and said, you need to listen to this person. Everybody done that at some stage? And because they trust you, they will go and listen to that person. We need that to be no more than 3 degrees of separation. Because what that will do is it will create the channels through which knowledge, which we don't know we need yet, can be distributed very quickly. And that's one of the big things we're doing on my US contract. We're going to start to entangle people from the different silos in informal networks. We're not going to decide what they should do, but we know if we just entangle them so they can communicate very quickly, then solutions will emerge when they're needed. Right, so that's an example, and we'll take you a method on that. It's called entangled trios. So that's kind of like one. Next one, these are antelope. Yeah. Now, there's a really good exercise you can do if you feel like it. We're not going to do it now because we've got too many desks, all right? You take a group of this size and you say to them, I'm about to give you an instruction. Do not look at anybody or say anything after I've given the instruction. That's really important. Then you say, identify somebody in the room who is your best friend and somebody in the room who is your worst enemy. You then say you can pick people at random, but people never do, so watch carefully at this point because it will tell you a lot about the organization. Right? And then you say, organize yourself so your best friend is between you and your worst enemy. I behave selfishly. Yeah? And the group dissipates over the room. You then flip the rule and say, protect your friend from your enemy, and the group clumps together in the middle of the room in seconds. Yeah, and this is a really good illustration about a heuristic. A simple switch in heuristic produces a radical change in behavior, which is a key complexity lesson, but it's actually how antelope protect themselves from predators. So if a predator arrives, each antelope identifies another antelope, generally by the marks on its bottom. That's why they're so vivid. And then they place themselves between the predator and that antelope, and that keeps the herd together so there are no stragglers and the predators can't pick them off. We're now looking at that as a new way of thinking about society. How do you make sure a society stays aligned without having to have a goal or a purpose? Because having a goal or a purpose means you've got to work out in advance what you want, and that's dangerous. But if I know everybody will stay together, even if we go in a different direction, that's a different process. And I'll start to talk about some of that work that's currently going into practice. So alignment is more important than purpose. Yeah? So again, we'll talk about that and some of the mapping techniques for that. But again, it's another example of self-organization. And then the big one, which I was just referencing indirectly, this is a bee swarm. So in a bee hive, all right, what actually happens is there's a temperature-triggered change, which means the drones hatch out a new queen. Yeah, and then a certain number of the drones go with the queen and they hang off a branch. Yeah? What then happens is each individual bee flies off the swarm, goes to find and investigates where they could actually have a new hive. They can arrive back on the swarm and they dance a figure-of-8 dance. It's called a waggle dance. The plane of the figure-of-8, the angle of the plane to the sun, tells the other bees where to go, and the intensity of the dance says how good a home they think it is. And there are some bees which actually disrupt the dance of other bees, which is important statistically, if you know it. And then after 2 or 3 days, all of a sudden, the entire swarm goes to a new location, and it's always the best location of all the ones that they looked at. If you want the papers on this, I've just written a major book chapter on it. Now, that's actually really interesting. So let's go back to what I said earlier about involving the whole workforce. What we can now do is we can go to the workforce, get them to index where they think we are. Then we can look at anomalies in that, and we can feed the anomalies backwards and forwards to different groups until we have a consensus. So instead of trying to direct the company by what I, as an executive, think it should do, we can see what is actually sustainable in the group, and we can experiment with different techniques. Now, again, this is distributed intelligence. That's really important in creating these context-specific solutions. And again, the principle is you don't have a directing intelligence, but the directing intelligence observes the patterns which emerge and decide which are favorable. Now, that politically is really important. Yeah, you need to see what patterns are sustainable culturally in your society before you do an intervention. You can't take a culture from another culture and just impose it because it's a good solution. You have to see when the dispositional state of the system is ready for change. And remember, that's weak signal detection. Yeah, it's not just when will they support terrorism, it's when will they support reform, for example. Yeah, because there's a point where you can see in the narrative that people are prepared to change. That's when you put the initiative in. You don't try and make them change. You wait till the dispositional state is available for change. And again, this is a way of reducing cost and increasing effectiveness. So that's kind of like there. That then leads me on to one of the ways that if we talk about it. So this is complex adaptive systems theory. It's a comparative research. You can trace it back to Poincare in mathematics, Prigogine in chemistry, Kaufman in biology, Arthur in economics, myself, Boisseau, and others in social systems. Most of the people who are involved in setting up complexity theory are still alive, so it's comparatively recent, right? It's not the same thing as systems thinking. Please don't confuse the two, all right? That they have different pathways. There are some coincidences, but there are different pathways. So complexity theory comes from the natural sciences. Systems thinking all traces back to Ashby and Shannon's theory of information, which were designed for machine processors. Right? And that's the problem. Yeah? And you can see at the time, hugely intelligent, but that's different. So there's coincidences, but differences. Yeah? So complexity theory deals with systems which have many entanglements. Alicia Gerardo, this won't work in Saudi Arabia, but she has this concept of like bramble bushes in a thicket. But you can think of it like a mangrove swamp. Everything is connected with everything else, but you can't understand the connections. And if you do something, all you get is unintended consequences. The only guarantee I can give you of a complex adaptive system is whatever you do will have unintended consequences. Everything else is uncertain. Now, the best way I've learned to explain this, and I'm going to give you the test now, has anybody heard the Anglo-Saxon phrase, why didn't we join up the dots? Okay, if you read the congressional report on 9/11, which I recommend, all right, it's actually good reading. It starts off by establishing that the good guys were very, very good and the bad guys were very, very bad, because there's a genre of American fiction you have to fit into. And it then says, well, look, somebody actually spotted that people who've been trained to take off and fly but not land. Now, after 9/11, we can all see how significant that is. Right? So they say, why didn't we join up the dots? And this is characteristic of any government inquiry or any safety inquiry, is people say they look backwards with the benefit of hindsight and say, this went wrong. Now we can work out why it went wrong. Why didn't we join up the dots? So that's the phrase. Okay. Right. So to give you a problem, let's look at dots. So if I have, I'm just trying to get the Apple Pencil to work. Okay, I'll have to do this verbally and sort that out at the break. So if I have 4 dots, everybody got that? Then there are 6 connections that can form between the dots. So 4 dots, I've got the square and I've got the 2 diagonals. That means if I take a dot or a link or any combination as a pattern, there are 64 possible patterns. So 4 dots, 64 patterns. If I go up to 10 dots, how many patterns are there? Guesses, please. 4 is 64. What do you think it is with 10? Somebody said something over there? 2 million. How many people think 2 million is too high? No, I thought you said 2 million. We'll go with 2 million, all right? How many people think 2 million is too high? Too low? Not answering because you know you're going to get it wrong anyway? Okay, it's too low. Anybody want to have another guess? 100 million? How many people think 100 million is too high? Too low? Yeah, okay, again the pattern. It's actually just under 3.4 trillion. If I go up to 12 dots, it's just under 4.8 quadrillion. There's an old Chinese story about this, about a Chinese sage who taught the Indian emperor how to play chess. And the Indian emperor said, what reward do you want? He said, I'll have 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard and double thereafter. And there wasn't enough rice in India. How many dots are there in the human system? How many possible patterns are there? With the benefit of hindsight, anybody can join up the dots. But hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. This is the most difficult thing to understand about complexity. When I look backwards, I can create linear causal changes, but I can't create them at the time because there are too many possible patterns that can fall out. I should say the more senior people, the lower number they guess. That's anecdotal, but that's my experience. Yeah? So hold that concept, because that really links in with this idea of complexity. And this is a quote from Brian Arthur, who's a good friend, pioneered complexity in economics, lost tenure at Stanford. If you want to do something completely novel, don't accept the establishment to accept it. But the point he makes here is that complexity means you've got inherent continuous uncertainty. Yeah, you get some regularities, but you don't get repeatability. Now, actually, we don't have any problem at all about this, because it's how we manage our family and friends. You don't have a purpose statement for your family. You don't have key performance indicators for your children. You don't link any allowances you give them to the achievement of measurable targets on a monthly basis. Nobody would do that in their family, but we do it at work. The reality is, on a day-to-day basis with children and with family, we manage emergent patterns. We do small things. If it starts to work, we do more of it. If it doesn't work, we do less of it. Anybody with teenage children knows that manipulation is a key skill for a parent, right? You have to manipulate the environment in which they work so they're more likely to do the right things. So I might heavily emphasize this. We all know how to manage complexity because we do it every day of our lives, but we forget about it when we walk through the door of an office. Yeah, so this is kind of like a natural process in terms of the way we work. So that's kind of like a reminder of this. We're dealing with inherent uncertainty. And that leads me on to the final thing before I stop and give you a chance to have a discussion, right? So that is a termite's nest. Now that's an example of a regularity, right? So the termite's nest arises from termites responding with genetically encoded rules to 64 different pheromone places. If you actually look at the book studying ant behavior, all of ant behavior is based on pheromone triggers. So it will trigger people from cleaning the nest to hunting to combat. So everything is done at that micro level, agents being triggered to respond. Right? Again, that comes back to that nature point. So there's a regularity. I know a termite's nest has variation, but without that, once I've got enough examples, I can see that regularity, so that's important. But there are a limited number of things we can manage in a complex system, which is good news, because once you get the principles, it's quite easy. You're not measuring it like a machine, which requires an engineer. You're measuring it like a parent who knows how to manage children. And it's a principle on that. So basically, there are three. The key concept here, and the one which is most difficult to get, is the concept of emergence. So as things interact with other things, patterns form, which are called emergent patterns. You can't predict the properties of the whole from the properties of the parts. Okay? I'll give you an example from physics. This is me being nice to experimental physicists. Theoretical physicists said they can't be a superconductor because there's no way from what we know about the atom we can predict it. And the experimental physicists said to hell with it, so they just chucked atoms together and we got superconductors. Right? So properties which emerge cannot necessarily be predicted from the properties of the parts. The same is true on society, culture, religion, all sorts of things. You can't predict the outcome from the things which participate. Right? Now that's important because it also gives us huge opportunity. If we can stimulate the system, it will throw out patterns which might be more beneficial than the current ones we're working with. Right? Now, there are three necessary but not sufficient conditions for emergence to happen. And here I'm going to start to introduce a little bit more new language, but we need some new language. First thing is, there must be a significant number of what are called actants. Now, this is probably new language, all right? So this is actor network theory, it's process philosophy. The realization that in human systems, non-humans have actually agency. So a rule, a regulation, a building can actually have an impact on a system. Right? So it's not just human agents making decisions that count. We've got two other types of agents. Yes, we've got the actors, the humans, and all actors are actants, but not all actants are actors. That's the way to get it. We also have constraints. So constraints can contain things or they can connect things. Now, if a constraint is a container, then it's predictable. If it's a connection, it's less predictable. Yeah? One of the big differences between systems thinking and complexity science, aside from the word, one is a way of thinking, the other is a science, is that actually systems thinking defines systems as having boundaries. Complexity theory says actually some systems don't have boundaries, or not ones that can be known or defined. And that's because they're connected, but they're not contained. So understanding connection and containment is actually a key principle, and those are constraints. Can I come on to that? Because I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So I'll give you an example. So connection is, I support Cardiff Rugby. So if somebody else supports Cardiff Rugby, we've got a connection, and we've got a common way of talking, but it doesn't contain us. Yeah? So common values, common principles, yeah? All of those sort of things matter. So constraints contain or connect, and then probably there's another new word, a constructor. This comes from quantum mechanics. A constructor is something which transforms things, but doesn't itself change in the act of transformation. Now, those are really powerful, so I'll give you examples straight up. A ritual is a constructor. Yeah? Sorry, I'm a Catholic, you're Muslims, we have rituals. Rituals change the way you see the world. Yeah, they actually change the perception. Remember I said you don't scan more than 5% of the available? A ritual changes what you scan and how you scan it. If you look at a surgeon going into an operating theatre, they scrub up. The scrubbing up isn't just a matter of actually hygiene, it's a ritual which changes their identity. So it switches them from who they are to the role they're about to occupy. Rituals are really, really important in humans, and we neglect them at our peril. Yeah, they're really critical on safety. Yeah, if you change, we've done work on that in New Zealand by getting drivers to strap on heated belts before they unload lorries, and we've halved workplace accidents with that. Not with rules or regulation, by a ritual which changes the way people see and act in the world. So rituals are constructors. A process is a constructor. For anybody in software, a software object is a constructor. It's something which is stable, that you know if you put this in, it will come out like that. Now, constructor design is really important in political society. So creating constructors which produce predictability is critical. You can't produce predictability as they interact with each other, but they create points of stability. Yeah? Again, once you get this, life becomes a lot simpler, but it's very different from the way we've been trained to think. So basically, I've got a lot of actants. It's not number which counts, it's the significance of them. So there are lots of pebbles on a beach, but pebbles on the beach are not like ants. Yeah? Ants are interacting, they have some degree of agency in the way they work. So condition number one, I need a significant number of actants. And then I need highly rich, highly local interactions between those actants. Yeah? Remember I talked about ants? Yeah? And also proximity counts in humans. Yeah, if you meet with people, you behave in a different way. Yeah? I gave you an example there on identity. So I support Cardiff Rugby. Sorry, I'm Welsh. Rugby's a religion, right? Cardiff Rugby, if you don't know it, is the capital city rugby club. We never cheat. Yeah, absolutely never under any circumstances. We play by the rules. If the other side do well, we clap them. We're not hooligans, all right? So we're really nice people. And then there's those guys down the road in Llanelli. They definitely cheat. They bribe referees. It's the only reason we can give for the red card we got the last time we played them. And their crowd is partisan. So we hate the buggers. And we actually call them Turks because in the 19th century, they hijacked a Turkish ship and killed everybody, and we're not going to let them forget it. Right? But when the English arrive, we're all Welsh, yeah, without any question whatsoever. Right? Now, this is what we call coherent heterogeneity. It's the ability to be different in one context and the same in another. Right? And that's by the nature of the interaction and the context. So interactions really matter. And by the way, homogeneity is really dangerous. Because if a system is homogeneous, it doesn't evolve. So having a common value or a common set of principles is actually quite dangerous. It never actually happens because you get dissenters. If it ever did happen, the system wouldn't evolve anymore. And we're not English. We have T-shirts with "We support Wales" and anybody who's playing against England. So in the World Cup in soccer, I have to buy shirts for any team which is playing against England, all right? The New Zealanders have the same. We support New Zealand in anybody playing Australia, but they've added unless it's English, unless it's the English, all right? So it's interesting, we often define ourselves by not being something as much as we do by being something. And the trouble is, what you've got is this Enlightenment tradition. I mean, people thought the internet would bring everybody together. The internet hasn't brought everybody together. It's made us more apart. Because it was based on an idealistic model of what it is to be human. We're tribal. Yeah, we like to have tribal differences. There's nothing wrong with that, yeah, because actually it can produce a huge amount of tension and creativity. There's everything wrong with it if it gets taken to excess. This is Aristotle's law of the golden mean. Yeah, any human virtue, yeah, taken to excess loses all value. Yeah, so saying I always lie is as bad as saying I never lie. Yeah, you know, everybody knows that sometimes you don't tell the truth. There's a balance between them, and that's called the golden mean. Yeah? So that's a principle. And then the third condition, so a significant number of actants, very rich local interactions. The third thing, remember I came back to insects, no direct intelligence? Nobody must think they can see the system holistically. This really upsets a lot of systems thinkers because they want to see the system holistically. The fact is you can't because there are too many variations. And if you try and see the system holistically, you pervert it based around your opinion about what should happen, so you don't see novelty. Okay? Now, the consequence of that is that I need monitors. Now, we'll talk about this later when we talk about human sensor networks. I've already hinted at that. How do you make the whole of your workforce a continuous monitoring system at a micro level? So when patterns start to emerge, you see them before you see them on conventional means. And we're going to talk a lot about that. Yeah, how do I distribute intelligence into the system, but how do I make sure it triggers an alert when something is starting to happen that I need to pay attention to? In one of my daughter's teenage parties, the CIA lent me some surveillance equipment. I sort of still feel slightly guilty about this, but I needed to know what was going on, all right? So you actually do need a surveillance system in place, yeah, in order to spot patterns early. The sooner you spot them, the lower the energy cost of amplification or of disruption. And the trouble is conventional scanning see things too late. Yeah, by the time we see them, we haven't got an opportunity. Yeah. And then from that, we also get the concept of scaffolding. So scaffolding is an actant which can't change. So for example, in the UK, one of our constraints is you have to drive on the left-hand side of the road. We really do not want, which side of the road you drive on to be an emergent property of cars driving together simultaneously. That is, if anybody's driven in Italy, south of Naples. Okay, if you ever do, I'll tell you how to do it. Don't follow the rules. Follow the next car, match speed, avoid collision. That's actually how birds flock in the sky. If you drive on that basis, it's quite stable, all right? And same as India, all right? But do not try and follow the rules. Whereas in Germany, they drive on the right, UK, we drive on the left, and so on. Yeah? So we're more than capable of creating scaffolding, i.e. structures, which are stable. And we're going to talk about how we do that later and give you an exercise on it. So basically, if I'm managing a complex system, it's very simple. This is the Ames framework. What are the actants? What are the interactions? What are the monitors? What's scaffolding? And those are the only things I can change. And if I focus on changing that, I use a lot less energy and I'm more likely to spot novelty quite quickly. Okay, so I think that's probably enough before you have some sort of discussion. What time is our coffee break? 11:20. Oh, that's cool. Right, so that gives me 10 minutes, right? Just to ask for questions or anything which comes out on that. This has been the theory-heavy section. I did warn you, all right? But I need to fall back to this stuff continuously as we go into methods. Any questions? Any comments? Any arguments? Arguments would also be welcome. If not, I'll do one more thing before we break. Yeah, go on. Yeah, you get into problems on this because we really want to avoid postmodernism and the belief there isn't objective reality, right? The fact is the signals people were receiving were the same. And the signals we can monitor and identify. The fact there are different perceptions on that signals and we need to measure that, we know that that's significant, right? So it's not that color is an arbitrary phenomenon. Color is word language we assign to a sensory signal that we get. And if you don't have the right, sorry, let me divert that. This is a key principle, which is neurodivergency. right? So I have written several articles with somebody who's synesthesiac. Right? So her brain crosswires so she sees text as colours. So she'll phone me up and say, "You're writing mucky green again, not slate grey, please change." Because if I write mucky green, she literally can't read the text because everything blurs together. Right? Now, I know what she means, but she's really powerful at spotting patterns. I'm dyslexic. Yeah, so apology up front, I cannot pronounce words from text. I literally can't do that. Yeah, I need somebody to tell me how to pronounce it and teach me many times and create a sort of mental trick to create the two together. Gives me, languages are almost impossible to learn if you're dyslexic. But I read 2 pages of a book in about 10 seconds and see a pattern. Right? And dyslexics will tell you this. They can see connections between things, but they can't explain it, and they can't see why you don't see it. Autism is key for mathematicians. So neurodiversity becomes important because people are processing the same information in very different ways. Yeah? And I think that's the thing we need to start to recognize. And the issue is, when is it significant, when it's a material difference and when it's a non-material difference. Well, that's kind of like, let's call that as a motivational factor. Yeah? And I'm really contrasting this with the concept of mission statements, purpose statements that you see, right? And just to make another point here, if anybody tells children bedtime stories, do you tell them stories about how they stayed at home, did what mummy and daddy said, and did good things? Anybody tell them those stories? I mean, all fairy story traditions in all cultures, including indigenous ones, basically tell negative stories, not positive stories. Because we know that avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy than imitation of success. So one of the ways you actually align an organization is to agree what you don't want to be, not what you do want to be. And that goes back to evolutionary history. It's very easy to get consensus on what we don't want to be. It's impossible to get consensus on what we do want to be without resorting to platitudes, which means it becomes meaningless. And we did a big research project when I was at IBM. We looked at the mission statements of 100 companies. There was an 80% correspondence in the words they used. There's only so many where they said, we're going to listen to our customers. Well, that's self-evident. Yeah? So I think there's a degree of, we want to survive, right? Okay, so that's a purpose, but it's not a purpose in terms of controlling the activity. Yeah? Yeah. So again, that concept of negative stories is actually much better. And the reason we teach our children negative stories is A, they wouldn't listen to the positive ones, but also it means they can discover new pathways that we didn't imagine. So we share the stories of our and previous generations' failures so they avoid that failure, but we leave open novel possibilities, and that's really important in a modern society. Yeah, if we close off possibilities, or we create a structure by which only if you say you're going to achieve X will you get funding, we're not going to get those novel discoveries. And I think it's quite interesting in the medical environment. We see the same in firefighters. It's easy to get people to confess to failure because they're confessing failure in the role they occupy, not as a person. Right? So roles will actually admit failure if it's ritualized over time, whereas individuals won't. So one of the ways we can talk about later is how do we create worst practice databases. So one of the most powerful ones I ever created, which I would love to do again, is we got doctors to tell the story of the first time they know they killed somebody. Because I've yet to meet a doctor who doesn't know they killed somebody by omission or by error. Now, we anonymized that, but that was the most powerful database we've ever created because they wanted to tell the story. They wanted anonymity, which we ensured, but that was the database young doctors read, not the database on how to cure a patient, but the database on how not to kill a patient. So negative stories are far more powerful than positive stories. And by the way, the brain pays more attention to failure than it does to success. The brain will pick up failure almost instantly because it creates what's called an anomaly, which I'll come to later. Failure creates an anomaly, so your brain switches into action. If you don't get an anomaly, the brain doesn't really engage in decision-making. And that's the key thing. I mean, I go walking with 3 doctors, right? Which my wife thinks this is a safety measure. I say 1 doctor is a safety measure, 3 doctors is an argument, all right? And one of them is a consultant, which makes it even worse, all right? But one of the things they say is they don't want to be operated on by anybody under the age of 55. The doctor said that because when they were being trained, they were trained in a team with a senior consultant, with junior consultants, they all work together. So actually they could pick up on each other's failure. It's contextual. Then the British Health Service got involved in business process re-engineering, and now teams are put together from roles, and the roles don't know how to interact with each other anymore, and they've lost that capability. The other massive failure in the British health system was we got rid of nurses' hostels. So nurses used to leave school, and they were all lived in the same area, working on the hospital. So there was a huge amount of support and information flow in the kitchens of the nurses' residences. Then we got rid of it, and they all lived separately, and that actually has created mental health crisis and all sorts of other things. So this concept of people working together in small groups and building that network capability is really important. And in medical provision, you're always talking about what's called a crew, not a team. Yeah, people are trained in role and role expectation, and that's what makes it work. The trouble is they have to grow into that role. It's not something which can happen on a 2-week training course. Okay, so 2 comments on that. One is they may be right. Just be aware that, 30 or 40, I know I'm biased because I'm 70, all right? But I now know I should have listened to my father, all right? I'm trying to explain that to my son, who's trying to explain it to my grandchild. But there is that problem. We'll talk about this after the break. One of the things you want to do is to create small level tension between older and younger people. It's called a transgenerational pair. Yeah, because you want the wisdom of the old and the naivety of the young. So somebody who's just qualified as a driver will see the world very differently from somebody who's been driving for 30 years. And both types of knowledge are important. And there's a phrase I often use is pay attention to the cynics because they care. Cynics in organizations, when you're running a change program, they're really frustrating. But it's in their interest to be nice and to go along with it. The fact they're refusing to do that means they've spotted something you haven't spotted. So paying attention to the cynics is really important.